Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Arcane Observer. This is episode 9. Thank you so much for tuning in to Troubled Minds Radio Network, KUAP, digital radio. And I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm going to be talking about the Skull and Bones Secret Society and about secret societies in general and how they may be controlling the world or lending to the manipulation of world affairs. So let me just begin by saying that I have a YouTube channel called the Arcane Observer, and you can find that by typing it into YouTube search box, and it should pop right up for you. I have about 55 videos. Be sure to check them out. I try to talk about symbolism and the esoteric, and just kind of fun, just speculating about world events and things like that, and how they may tie in to a greater conspiracy or stranger mysteries. So anyway, be sure to check that out when you get a chance. So anyway, today I'm going to be going into talking about how secret societies are controlling the world and to what extent they are controlling the world. So let's begin by talking about the educational system as it's designed by Hegelian um, oligarchs and technocrats, and how these people have been in control and how it's influencing the narcotics trade. And I'd like to mention that about many people haven't heard about the Bush family. Not everybody, but a lot of people have probably heard, but that the Bush family itself was deeply ingrained in not just the Skull and Bones, but also in the CIA, and also the possibly even the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Jr. So when we're talking about the narcotics trade and the opium trade that made many of these families that attend the finest colleges and are members of these secret societies, they themselves have become extremely wealthy due to the opiate trades out of China. Some people speculate that even the war in Vietnam was actually a war over what's called the Golden Triangle, which would secure the narcotics trade with the United States. And that when Ross Perot was appointed by Bush to work on the POW and the MIA soldiers in Vietnam, when he came back, he claimed, and before he resigned from his post, that he was looking for lost soldiers, but all he could find was a lot of cocaine. So I thought that that was really interesting to mention, and how this ties into the Iran-Contra situation as well. And it's been said that Nixon, during Watergate, when he was talking about the Bay of Pigs, it was actually code for the Kennedy assassination, and that he referred to the Texans and the Cubans. And this also had to do with the when they were trying to transfer the opium narcotic industry from China more so to center in South America. And that a lot of money has been, and also this ties into the oil as well, that the Zapata oil, um, kind of an event that was tied into Bay of Pigs, that it also was necessary to secure these oil outposts for these narcotic trades, and it's not often discussed. So these families have gained their wealth and even perhaps funded the creation of, like, for example, I've heard that Colombia was funded by the Chinese opiate trade that the United States has secured. And many of these who secured the money to fund these large enterprises are connected with Yale University, the OSS, CIA, and the Skull and Bones, which is what I wanted to kind of touch down on. But so if you go through the list of members of Skull and Bones, and you see the connection with these gentlemen out of Yale, and now females as well, though, because they have become co-ed to a point, It's a 15 notorious gentlemen chosen out of uh, their junior year, and they are initiated in what's considered like a sort of being born again. Like Bush talked about that when he was asked if he was a Christian, he replied that if you mean, have I been born again, then yes, I am a Christian, because they think that by going through this ritual of dying and going into the coffin and then revealing all their sexual secrets and exploits and all kinds of other weird stuff, that somehow this creates some type of sort of spiritual rebirth where they become loyal and born again into their life of world affairs and influence. Um, then that's how that kind of goes. However, though, back to the coffin thing, it's interesting in all these rituals that they do that entail the going into a coffin. That was also practiced by the like Anton LaVey when he talked about going into the coffin and coming back up again. And the same thing is done in the skull and bones rituals, where people report hearing them moaning and screaming, that they could hear it completely across the schoolyard when the young men are being initiated that first night. And so it is this idea that the skull and bones is they are going into the tomb. When you see it's called their tomb that they have most of their meetings in is covered in all of this Virginia creeper vine, and so it's pretty much completely covered by this greenery, which makes it very. It has no windows. When you go in, it is a tomb. And so the room 322 is the room where they do the initiation, supposedly. And in these initiations, the person's supposed to confess all kinds of extremely personal. They're trying to get this information on the individual, usually to lord it over them later, or to give them the feeling of confidentiality that they can trust their fellow bonesmen, that the secret is safe with them back to the sub rosa. And the sub rosa being the secret under the rose. I don't know if I was going to mention it again, but that everything done under the rose is kept in secret. The Roman dining halls had their ceilings painted with the rose too, because everything that was done or discussed at dinner was kept secret and wouldn't be revealed. And this goes back to Cupid and Venus and things like this. So it's got like a Greek and Roman mythology behind it, but you'll see that the rose is very symbolic as a representation of Mary, representing the mysteries of Mary, I suppose. And I would say too that the rosy cross, using the rose as a symbol, is talking about, because they have a Islamic magic tradition as well as Hermeticism and a mixture of mystical Christianity and Gnosticism in the Rosy Cross Rosicrucians, which are closely tied into the Thule Society. And the Thule Society seems to have some kind of connection also with the Skull and Bones, and some people have speculated that Skull and Bones may have some type of connection to the Nazis. However, there's no concrete evidence, in my opinion, to link the Skull and Bones to the Nazis by ideology. However, it is pretty well known that the banks that the Bush family owned partisan in did fund some aspects of the Nazi Party in World War II, and that it's possible in that regard. And then also, too, through the occult interests and the esoteric interests of some of the members of the Nazi Party who may have been members of the Thule Society that became, some say, did become part of the nationalist party of the Nazis. So there is certainly a strong connection between the Thule Society and the Nazi Party, but how deep is the connection between the Skull and Bones and the Thule Society, therefore, or the Nazis? Because if we're just going to go by the fact that some world leaders protected other world leaders, that ties in very prominently to the secret society um, organization around the world, that there are several small secret societies that lend their practices to each other to secure business deals and cooperations to further their own agendas. That's why you have the Council on Foreign Relations. And though, like I've said before, that even though these Council on Foreign Relations or NATO or the World Health Organization, that they themselves are open societies that reveal their memberships and that openly discuss to a point what their policies are, what they're planning to do. People just often choose not to read those things or read those papers that they do openly put out. But I will say that amongst the ranks of them, and in some cases, the creators of, for example, the Council on Foreign Relations, that they were also former members of the Skull and Bones in that instance. So, anyway, I wonder, trying to figure out what this has to do with where does it begin. I can trace it back to I think I trace it back to the priesthoods of the ancient world. For example, there were several priests. There was this old belief about the skull itself. I'm going to talk about skull cults just for a minute because I think that this ties into it. Since we see the skull, the Thule Society had a skull that they kept under glass in their own facilities. The Thule Society, if it did have some type of links, which it seems to apparently have had, kind of clearly so, to the Nazi Party, they also implemented the skull and bones symbology. The skull being used by the Prussians, or the Prussians, I suppose, Prussia, and then it also being utilized by the skull and bones as a symbol, by pirates, by every, there's just this prominence about the skull and bones. We have to go into what I think it might have to do with. And what I think it might have to do with is this esoteric belief that the skull has several different superstitions around it and very deep. Like, for example, they found like 13 priests in Peru that had all had trepanning done. Trepanning, also called trephyphoning, well, they drill a hole. It's one of the earliest surgical methods of relieving migraines, or it's one of the earliest forms of surgery, basically. And they cut a small hole in a particular spot on the skull, and it's supposed to relieve pressure. It's also used as a form of exorcism, or like as a form of to do with a spiritual thing. In fact, very recently there was this guy, John Mellon, I think, and what he did was he trepanned himself so he could stay, quote, high all the time. It's strange, and he learned this apparently from some anthropologist that he'd been working with, because they found some skulls in Peru that most likely belonged to some priests, and they had been trepanned, and possibly it had been done on purpose. It's kind of strange, but you also see this, among the Inuit practiced it. They would drill the hole with reindeer antler, and then they would pack it with reindeer fat, and then wrap it up. You have this whole big thing about the skull anyway. You have the elongated skull. Some people have believed this was to imitate, to look like aliens that they had maybe seen. In fact, though, I think that they, from what I can gather, that they believed that the skull was of babies was particularly prone to having trouble from the spirit realm, or being attacked by demons and causing them issue. Of course, they were aware that the skull was soft and was still forming, so they would wrap the skull to try to protect it, and this would cause the elongation. That seems to be something that many different anthropologists agree upon. I kind of tend to think so too, because I think it still ties into the spiritual beliefs that they held. There could have been lots of other reasons why they did it, but back to trepanning. So this a lot of times was done to release like demons and stuff too, but it also makes a zombie. So you have the cases where, for example, among the tribes of Borneo, they have this very complicated belief system about the afterlife. In general, they believe that the flesh and the bones, well, that the flesh, the meat of the body, like the body itself, that it has its own soul connected to all of the matter and basically like everything that's in this realm, what it's all made out of, that has a soul of its own. And then there is another soul that is like the spark of life. This is also popular in Papua New Guinea. So that where there's some impoundment that they believe this too. So many tribal people have this belief. Anyway, when when the person dies, there's this issue that they suddenly are vulnerable while they're decaying. That they can become. It can not only can the soul of the body, this two-part soul, the first soul goes on to heaven, can go on to heaven, but typically it won't stay there according to their belief systems because it misses its other half of its soul that was its body. And that part of their soul is going through a very difficult process of releasing the physical matter life that they had before. And also, upon observing the state of themselves, kind of go get very pernicious and can stir things up for the village, thereby, causing hauntings, misfortune, even death, sometimes even seeking revenge. Speaking of seeking revenge and trying to appease that in the case of the Borneo people by doing sacrifices, wherein they trepan their victims before doing the sacrifices and then torture them. The point of the trepanning, though, is to make them like zombies. Anyway, though, back to what I was going to say, kind of. So the fear that the dead coming back to haunt you also ties into European lore about vampires. Now, what I think is very interesting about the skull and bones, and the skull sitting atop the two crossed femur bones, is also considered a vampire burial. So it's the same thing you see in Eastern Europe and across the Balkans, even into kind of modern times, where individuals were buried with their femur bones crossed with the skull on top so they could not rise up out of the grave and wreak havoc on family or their enemies. It would make sense that taking the skull and bones the skull and bones symbol for the secret society skull and bones, if they sought to prevent revenge by those that they have wronged in the past. I don't know though, because you also have the skull and bones being a symbol of death, and that sign is even in the cemeteries of Spain. They use real skull and cross, or they did. They use real skull and crossbones over their cemeteries and their mausoleums as a symbol of the dead. But the vampire burial of putting the bones crossed with the skull on top is called a vampire burial. So I think that's interesting. But there's also this belief system too that if you have the skull of someone, it's a type of talisman. Strangely enough, not to mention the Nazis too often, but the Nazis carried around a skull as a form of talisman as well, believing it to offer them some type of protection or, well, like as a good luck charm of sorts, which is really disturbing. But so the Skull and Bones Society supposedly has, some people have said, the skull of the Apache warrior chief, the Apache warrior chief Geronimo, that they took his skull from his grave in Oklahoma, I think in Stillmore, Oklahoma. So they got the skull and they brought it to their tomb, there on the Yale campus. And supposedly, I've heard that they believe, and many other societies believe, like the Thule Society believed, that if you had these skulls, you could use it as a way to communicate with the spirits world, or the spirit world. They would also believe that they were being, maybe the power of these individuals would be bestowed upon them because they possessed the skull. What's strange about that is these skull cults, like I've mentioned, you have the in Borneo, they're headhunters. The Dayak people. The Dayak people were headhunters, but also they were skull cult. But Gobekli Tepe was also the location of these skull cults. And if it's to be believed that somehow these the Skull and Bones is somehow also a skull cult of some kind, is what I'm kind of leaning on, I guess. The skull cults are also located in Europe. So it's not something exclusive to Mesoamerica. These skull cults also exist amongst the ancient tribes of the Celts and the Gauls and over Germania. So there is mention of these skull cults throughout the European regions as well. And they also carry the skulls, the Picts. The Picts also of Ireland also practiced this skull cult like behavior. Back to Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe had a lot of their stone carvings and things would show animals holding what appear to be severed heads. And then they found many bones of and human bones and skulls, which could have been for honorary purposes. But it's interesting that, and Benjamin Franklin as well, who was not actually, cannot be confided that he was a member of the Hellfire Club, but had many correspondences through letter with the Hellfire Club, other members of the Hellfire Club, and was known to attend some of the meetings of the Hellfire Club, though officially not a member of the Hellfire Club. It was found in his house in Craven Street that there were at least the remains of I think it was like 13 human remains, maybe a couple of cats, things like this, and their skulls had been trepanned. They had had holes drilled into them, which is not, I guess, that bizarre. If they had been doing some type of strange, like experimentation with medical stuff or trying to do medical things. It is odd, though. I wonder if the Hellfire Club got up to something really weird and were trepanning themselves to try to, make contact or with the spirit realm or to gain some type of elusive consciousness, as many of the ancient priests did. Now, I wouldn't say that they were known for their debauchery, though. Who knows? It's possible. So, I want to thank you for listening to episode 9 of the Arcane Observer and for tuning in to the Troubled Minds Radio Network. Here you've probably heard many of the friends of Michael Strange's show from Troubled Minds. Those include, Salsido Paranormal with James Salsido and Serena. She started a wonderful show as well here on KUAP. And I've heard there's more to come. And then myself, obviously, the Arcane Observer. But I hope you enjoy listening to these types of topics. I know that there's so much to get into. It's going to be hard to cover it all in one episode. But you won't be disappointed, as there are many things to cover and possibly things you haven't heard before. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, you can do that. Like I said before, you can search it, The Arcane Observer, on YouTube, and check out my videos there. And I want to mention a couple more things, though. So, like I was saying, these skull cults are not exclusive to Mesoamerica. They're all around Europe. It's strange that this trepanning thing, I think it's odd that Jeffrey Dahmer practiced trepanning on one of his victims. It just occurred to me that he also tried to create a zombie through this trepanning by drilling a small hole. And then it makes me think, too, about this prolific thing with the serial killers anyway, that Ted Bundy also practiced a type of headhunting, if you'd believe it. I mean, they found all those bleached skulls, victims of Bundy, up on Taylor Mountain in 1975. And though they would say that, of course, he was not a part of any type of cult, I disagree. And I'll go into why I disagree, because I think that there are connections with these individuals and what's known as the family, and there's a lot of connections. But all of it, what it does all have in common is that these are members of secret societies, secret organizations, sub rosa, the secrets under the rose, not to be revealed to the common people. Anyway, Thank you for listening and have a great day.